Regan, where are we at the moment?
A very simple answer to that and a very complicated answer. We are waiting for a second tier judicial review judgment because the two campaign groups who were registered with the inspection and the planning process and so on got together and sought a judicial review, which was then itself subject to a review because the legal issues are obviously very, very complicated. The basis of the judicial review was that the inspectors turned down most of the arguments put by the campaigners who were opposed to it on environmental grounds that Suffolk was the wrong place for it, all sorts of reasons. And the inspectors set those aside and took up as a substantive issue the fact that there is no natural water supply for either to build the thing or to operate it, because it needs fresh water to operate. And they also had some reservations about some of the nature, the environmental regulations, and whether they had been properly mitigated by EDF in the planning inspection. They were referred to Kwasi Boateng, the then Secretary of State, who normally a Secretary of State would issue a letter of 3 or 4 pages agreeing or disagreeing with the inspectors, but he issued a letter, I think it was of the order of 70 to 80 pages, of argument rejecting the inspector's view, which was that they were opposed to it until the water supply issue could be resolved and these regulatory issues could be resolved. That's what led to the judicial review, and a ruling on the judicial review was by a judge who is experienced in environmental and planning matters, was expected last month, but the indications are that it's probably going to be quite delayed, and it'd be fair to draw the conclusion that it's probably going to be a very complicated ruling. What's important to say, I think, is that, and this goes back to the previous question about time and delay, is that the Sizewell B station, which is on site and running and is quite economic and seems to be relatively trouble-free whether you're in favour of it or not, Sizewell B only came about as a result of a 3-year public inquiry, and it was the length of that public inquiry and the delay in building Sizewell B that led to the policy people in government deciding they needed a quicker law. What has in fact happened is that the law has got more complicated. Lots of changes have taken place in public understanding about protecting nature and so on. And membership of Europe brought in lots of very, very sophisticated environmental law. And I mean, it's quite a paradox really, but the old process of public inquiry now looks as though it might have been simpler and quicker. But we are certainly, waiting for a judicial review, and the judicial review, it could go either way. It might come out with a very complicated ruling, and a bit because some of us have been looking at big planning court cases, particularly judicial review. There is a possibility that the judicial review would come up with a recommendation that certain aspects of the project are changed, rather than actually being for or against it going ahead. Quite apart from that, there is now a very, very active funding regime because it has been it's been uncovered, and the little group of background researchers that I've been involved with we discovered and got into the inquiry the fact that though EDF are, you know, huge nationalised industry in France, though it looked as though, like Hinkley, which is, go on. Oh, it's the dustbin men. There'll only be a minute. Do you want to shut the window?
No, just let them go.
Let them go. Yeah. No, all I want to do is get the funding in, because
Right, just carry on. Start. Carry on.
Carry on. I was talking about funding. Funding has always been a question, but it's now probably the dominant issue, because we were able to reveal that in the official application to the government to give a licence to create it, we uncovered the fact that EDF didn't want to carry on owning it once it was built. They wanted to sell off 80% of it and only retain a 20% interest, which is different to the arrangement at Hinkley. And one of the campaign groups, this is the community-based group called now Sizewell C, have been very active going to funding organisations like big pension funds and big insurance funds, lobbying them to say, do not invest in this as a market, you know, as a market investment project. And EDF itself is in considerable trouble in France. I think my memory is that it was 80% nationalised and 20% of the shares were owned by other people, including American investors. They are being bought out. There is quite a crisis in the French nuclear industry itself, where a large, it's the world's biggest nuclear power plant, is being built at Flamanville in Brittany, and that project, which is just for one of them, has itself run into funding problems, engineering problems, there are safety questions about it, and that has all fed through into what the media, to the extent they pick it up, private eyes certainly have been quite good, sometimes sniping at the project, is now obviously a very, very long public agenda, quite independently of what happens to the judicial review. So in other words, you know, a judicial review could go through, whitewash the project, and then there's still a problem with investment and finding the money for it. So, crudely speaking, that's what's happening now, but the legal process and the campaigning process has now got to really focus on the funding issue, and I think, you know, persuading possibly a future Labour government that this is not a good way to spend money.